You are listening to Part 8 of our series, The 7 Medicines, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio. Hello, Susan. Welcome back to Time Monk Radio.
Thank you, Gemini. Did you have any more thoughts about your room of origins?
I'm glad you asked. Yes.
I thought you might have.
Well, I love birds, and especially the mockingbirds, and they will leave me beautiful feathers occasionally, or a blue jay will leave me a gorgeous blue feather. So I got to thinking about that.
All right. So there's something you can put in your room of origins.
Yes.
Yes, and as we said, that might make you even more curious about how does this blue jay come to leave this feather from me? How does this blue jay come to be living where I'm living?
Yes.
So we can use this as a springboard for what I call reweaving the healing cloak of the ancients. And for me, reweaving the healing cloak of the ancients is a metaphor for telling the stories that weave us back into wholeness, telling the stories that help us understand how to live and what we can really choose. As I said last week, when we first come to story medicine, we're coming because we need a story. We need an archetype. We need a storyline. We need to understand how it is that we can proceed, especially if we have an injury, if we have a problem, if we have a pain. We want the story of that. When I injured my wrist in January in Costa Rica, the most important things to me about that were the stories that I received. And these were the stories from people who had already been through the experience. So my need for a story coming into that experience was taken care of by those who had been through the experience and could now tell me their story. And just as in the first week of this month, we talked about Farmer John telling me his story and how I benefited from being told that story, but also how he benefited from having that story heard. And our three-legged stool of nourishment, what we actually eat, the rituals in our lives, small and large, and compassionate listening, being heard. What we eat, the rituals in our life, and being heard. The three legs of nourishment. It is important for our stories to be heard. So one of the women who told me her story told me a story of having an injury like my injury. Only what happened when she got this injury was she was taken to a hospital. She was x-rayed. Because she was x-rayed, she was put into surgery. They pinned, screwed, wired, and put plates into her wrist in order to bring the bones back into line. And she told us in somewhat excruciating and quite horrifying detail all of the things that were done to her wrist, and then showed me what she could do with her wrist after all of this high-tech repair and after physical therapy. And I looked at her, and I looked at her wrist, and I said, that's the very, very best that modern medicine can do. I don't know whether my wrist is broken or not because I haven't had an x-ray, but I know even if my wrist is broken, I can do better than that. That story was so powerful to me because it was a story from someone who had been there, done that, and I said, that's it. That's as good as it gets. I can do better. I know I can do better, and I can do better without screws, wires, plates, pins. The second story that came to me was a second-hand story. This first story was, the person was right there. This had happened to her, and she was telling me her story. The other story was the story of a son of one of the women who was there, who broke his ankle. He knew it was broken because he was taken to the hospital. It was x-rayed, and the doctor said, your ankle is not just broken, it's dislocated, and it's a big mess in there. And it's so swollen, we can't do anything right now. You go home, ice it, elevate it, come back in 2 weeks, and we'll cut you open, put your ankle right, and it'll heal fine. So he didn't go home and just sit around. He went home, and he took care of his ankle. And when they came out from doing the surgery, they looked at him rather shamefaced and said, we should have done another x-ray before we did the surgery because your ankle is almost completely healed and all of the bones are in the right place. That, again, was a very important story for me, that this young man did the things I was intending to do. And the final chapter of his story was a very happy chapter, a chapter that I certainly hoped would be there from my story. Now, even as I am looking for a story about the injury to my wrist, I am also engaging in telling the story of what is going on. Because, again, we want to remember that story works in going in both directions. And that telling the story is an important part of healing. I was reading a very charming article written by a man who claims that he is the politest person he has ever met, and that he has always been interested in politeness ever since he was a child, and not just please and thank you and writing thank you notes, but real politeness, which has to do with really understanding what the other person might be needing. And he had, as one of his top suggestions for politeness, when you were at a party and you're introduced to someone, hold off for as long as possible asking them what they do. See if you can think up any other questions that you might be interested in about this person besides what they do. Eventually you will get there. It's the common question. All right? And when you do ask them what they do, no matter what they say, immediately follow that with, that must be hard. And he says those words will elicit from almost everyone a story about how hard their work is, because everybody thinks their work is hard. And that you will be connected with that person. We need to be heard. Being heard is healing. I went running off to town one evening. A past apprentice was coming into the Moon Lodge, and she'd taken the bus to Woodstock, and she said, I really want for you to come and pick me up. And I said, all right, I'll come and pick you up. And I got in the car, and I'm going down a local road, which is both hilly and curvy. So it goes up and down and right and left. And there are numerous blind areas on this road. We're all saved from death and disaster because there are a few roads that come into the road. But there's an especially bad part in this road where you go down into a dip, go around a curve, and come up right into traffic coming out of a street. Now, the street is hardly ever used. There's not much traffic there, so it's okay. But on this day, as I came up out of that blind spot, there was a van right in front of my car. I mean, right in front of my car. I remember thinking, goodbye, life. I'm now dead. This is it. I see my death in front of me. And I knew that turning my wheel wasn't going to do anything at all, because that van was turning in front of me. So it was actually turning into me. It was directly across the road where I was, and it was turning. So my turning was, I could either slam myself into the van, or I could really make us collide by turning the other way. There was really very, very few options that I had, and so I chose a shamanic option. This option is not generally available to us most of the time, but in extreme necessity, it is available to everyone, and is more available to those who have trained themselves to know that it is available. And that is because there was no way that I could avoid being in the same space with this other vehicle. I chose to be in a different time. And we came to rest side by side. Both vehicles totaled. No injury to any of the human beings in the vehicles. Needless to say, I never got to town to pick up the woman. But more interestingly, right at the time of this accident, just before all of the rescue crews came, because of course they did. The people who live in the house on that corner said they have to call the rescue crews frequently. And P.S., 2 weeks later, exactly the same accident happened. But this person didn't know how to leap through time, and they were all killed in their accident. So just before these crews arrived, another past apprentice was coming down the road to go to Moon Lodge, saw what had happened, pulled over, and was there with all of the herbal remedies that I needed right there at that time, because the universe truly does provide for us. I was able to get in her car, leaving my totaled car behind, and go to Moon Lodge and tell my story. I needed to tell the story, just as I'm telling the story now, and healing and nourishment is occurring for me because I'm telling you the story, this traumatic story, this time in which I truly felt I was going to die, is less and less stressful for me every time I tell it. And I have some hope that by telling this story, that you too will know that you have access to moving in a non-ordinary way through time. When the space you are and the space that you're in is going to be occupied by something else. There is a fourth dimension, and it is time, and we do have access to it, just as we can turn the wheel of the car. We can turn the wheel of time. When we tell each other stories, we expand each other's minds. We give each other ways of thinking. We give each other permission to act in ways that maybe we wouldn't have thought of. My favorite story along these lines, of course, is the story of the woman, and I should know her name, but I don't because it is one of my favorite stories. I should know it. The woman who was told by her doctor, well, you're pregnant again, and your first birth was a C-section, a cesarean section. So we're going to schedule a C-section for you for this one. And she said to the doctor, I don't understand why we're scheduling a cesarean section. The first cesarean section was needed. I was not able to complete the labor. I was not able to complete the delivery, and we needed to do a section. But how can you tell beforehand that I'm going to need a cesarean section this time? And the doctor said, because it's protocol. Once you've had a baby by section, you have all the rest of your babies by C-section. And this woman said, that doesn't make any sense to me. How do we know I would need it? And the doctor said, well, your uterus could burst. And she said, excuse me? Yes, you see, once you've had a C-section, because your uterus has been cut, it could burst. And she went home and she thought about that, and she came back and she said, that makes no sense to me. She said, you know, when you did the C-section, you cut my uterus, but you also cut my skin, and you sewed my skin up. And look, I've got a scar where you cut me. But that skin is just fine, and I'm not worried when I cough or sneeze that it's going to burst, and nobody else is worried that it's going to burst. Are you telling me that you did a poor job of sewing my uterus up? Are you telling me that it's not good enough? Why would we be worried about that? And, of course, the doctor had no beyond this story that the doctor had been told and had not examined or thought about. There was no reply, and the woman said, then what we're going to do is we're going to do a vaginal birth. And if I get to the point of that vaginal birth where I need a C-section, then we'll do the C-section. She said, but I want to try this one. Needless to say, this was very difficult. This was not the kind of thing that this obstetrician had ever done before, and of course was completely against training and protocol and everything else. And as a matter of fact, She was a little uncertain as to whether or not they were going to even be able to go through it, or if she was going to have to look for other help. But apparently it did work out, and she was successful. She had a vaginal birth, but it wasn't that she just had a vaginal birth and went home and said, good for me. She talked about it. She wrote about it. She went all over talking about it. She got articles printed everywhere, and she started an entire movement called VBAC, Vaginal Births After Cesarean. Thousands and thousands of other women have now had VBAC births, vaginal births after cesareans, because this one woman told her story. She chose not to believe the story she was being told. She chose a different story. She liked how that story came out. And so she went and she told that story and changed the lives of many, many people. What stories are you questioning? What stories that you've been told everybody believes in, do you believe in? And is that story true? Is margarine really healthier than butter? Is non-fat, low-fat, skim milk really better for you than whole milk? Is raw fish and raw milk and raw meat really a health hazard? Will you choose a story that you've bought, that you've believed, and ask yourself, on what basis? What do I know about this story? Would this story be able to go in my room of origins? Do I know where it comes from? Do I know who believes it? There's a story out, we've all heard it, that milk causes mucus. Where does this story come from? Because I am the kind of person who is curious, and because I have had the kind of teachers that I have had. When I heard that milk causes mucus, I asked myself, says who? Says who? This place, this place, this place, this place, and this place. Based on what? Says who? Who said this? Who started this? And I was actually able to find out who started it. An interesting man named Arnold Ehret. Arnold Ehret was an herbalist. He lived more than 100 years ago, I think about 150 years ago. And Arnold got into a lot of trouble. People that he gave herbs to died. We don't know if it's because the herbs he gave them or because they were going to die anyhow, but he got into quite a bit of trouble, and he was actually asked to stop practicing because of this trouble. And Arnold had quite the attitude, we must admit. And he said, well, I have no problem at all with stopping practicing because none of the rest of you know what you're doing. And since none of the rest of you know what you're doing, I'm going to go and I'm going to sequester myself in a cabin out in the woods, and I am going to devise and then write about true healing. So Arnold goes off to his cabin in the woods, and he decides, being trained in the heroic tradition, which believes in the humoral theory, and the humoral theory tells us there are 4 humors in the body, and one of those humors is mucus. Blood, mucus, black bile, and yellow bile are the 4 humors. And when these humors accumulate in the body, they cause all kinds of problems, and so we have to get rid of them. So Arnold decided that of these 4, the king of the humors was mucus, and that basically all disease was a result of mucus. We will get back to this belief, this story, in a moment. And so he determined that the way to be healthy was to counter mucus. And the best way to do this was to not eat foods that formed mucus. Now, I know that you have a very clear idea of mucus. And I'm sorry if that's a pun. In fact, I know that you are kind of going, ugh, because we're talking about mucus, because you're thinking of having a runny nose when you have a cold. Are you thinking of a little kid with green snot dripping down their nose? Are you thinking about coughing up wadsy phlegm from your lungs? Well, mucus, yuck, that's kind of gooey, awful stuff. But I have to tell you, that's not what Arnold Ehret was thinking at all. Gosh, I'm so sorry. Because, again, remember, this was a humor. And mucus is carried by the blood. So what Arnold did was he ate different foods, one after the other. But he ate them only for a period of days. So, for instance, he ate bread, and bread without anything else, for a period of 3 or 4 days. And he drank milk, and nothing but milk, for a period of 3 or 4 days. And he ate carrots, and nothing but carrots, for a period of 3 or 4 days. So he would take one food, he would eat that one food exclusively for a period of time, and at the end of that period of time, he would take his hunting knife, cut open his arm, and look at the blood, and determine whether or not the food was mucus-forming. Now, already I have begun to change your mind about this story, haven't I? Because you're now questioning what on earth Arnold Ehret meant when he said that milk is mucus forming, especially because it isn't exactly what you thought of as mucus, but I haven't been able to shift you very much because you've already decided that Arnold was just wrong about the mucus. He wasn't wrong about the milk. He just didn't really understand mucus, and you know that when you drink milk, it causes mucus. It causes mucus in your nose, in your mouth, in your chest, and you know that for sure. Really? Science doesn't back you up at all. Science says that if we take orange juice, milk, and water, and drink them, and then scientifically measure the amount of mucus in the upper respiratory system, which is the sinuses, the nose, the mouth, and the upper part of the esophagus, that one of those substances, we have milk, water, and orange juice, one of those substances on a scale of 1 to 10 in terms of the amount of mucus created is going to create a mucus situation which has to be called a 9. In other words, quite a bit of mucus in the upper respiratory system. One of those is going to be a 1, and one of them is going to be a 2. I give you a moment to decide for yourself. Milk, orange juice, water, which is 9, which is 2, which is 1. This is by science. Science is giving people these things to drink and then measuring the mucus in their mouth. And if you don't believe science, try it out for yourself. So which one is 9? The orange juice, of course. Haven't you ever noticed what happens when you drink a glass of orange juice? It's acidic, and mucus is protective. So your entire upper respiratory system, to protect itself against the acidity of the orange juice, makes mucus. Water is 2, and milk is 1. Milk is one of the least mucus-producing substances that we can consume. And in fact, I have often threatened that I will write a book called Susun Weed's Mucus-Filled Diet Healing Plan, because that's what Arnold Ehret's book was called, The Mucusless Diet Healing Plan, because mucus is your friend. In fact, Arnold could not have been further away from the mark. Not only does mucus not cause any disease at all, and I have been asking for over 20 years for anybody to tell me a disease caused by mucus, and no one has been able to come up with a disease caused by mucus, although mucus is a symptom in diseases. It isn't the causative. But when I ask about diseases caused by lack of mucus, there are so many that I couldn't name them all. Let's start at the top. Dry eyes, problems with the vision, sinus infections, colds, flus. Yes, these all happen due to lack of mucus. The sinuses in our heads are lined with mucus-producing cells. Mucus is supposed to be produced there, run down the back of the nose and down the throat because, not to terrorize you, every breath you take is loaded with pathogenic bacteria, isn't it? Come on. The world is alive. There's spores. There's all kinds of things in the air, not to mention dust mites and all that you're breathing in. And when we are producing enough mucus, all of those things are swept down the back of the nose, swept down the back of the throat, and swept into the stomach there to die. Horrible deaths with hydrochloric acid. Die, bacteria, die. And thus we're kept healthy. When mucus production slows down, as it often does in winter because of the dryness of heating systems, now the pathogens that we breathe in have an opportunity to colonize the sinuses, the nose, and the throat because we are not making sufficient mucus to sweep them down into the stomach. Going from the other end, walk into any drugstore and tell me what single problem most postmenopausal women are dealing with, and you will see the shelf of vaginal lubricants growing by 6 inches a month. Lack of mucus. Some women postmenopausally get so dry down there, have so little mucus left down there, that they actually have vaginal bleeding from walking because the tissues rub against each other. Everywhere that we want to be healthy, mucus is there to provide that for us, to provide protection against bacteria, to provide lubrication so that we're not worn into bloody messes by the friction and fray of daily life. We want lubrication. We want mucus, not the other way around. Arnold had something against what he called mucus, but it's not what we call mucus at all. And his remedy for it would have been to bleed the person, to use a lancet. Certainly not what we're interested in at all. Story medicine is such an amazing and interesting realm. I have in front of me a book called Remapping Your Mind, The Neuroscience of Self-Transformation Through Story, by Louis Mel Matrona, MD, PhD, with Barbara Mainguy, M.A. We are born into a world of stories that shape our behavior. When we reshape our personal, family, and cultural narratives, we can reshape the patterns of our lives. This book lays out this practice, showing you how to create new characters and new stories, ones that will inspire you and help you build healthier relationships with yourself, with others, and with the planet. I could easily talk for another month about story medicine. It is a medicine that is near and dear to my heart, and I have many stories that I could tell you about story medicine, but I think a month is enough to get you curious, to get you going, to get you with the room of origins, and to get you thinking, really, self-transformation through story. I never thought about that. Next month, we're going to go to the third medicine, which has a lot of different names. Faith medicine, vibrational medicine, mind medicine, placebo medicine, and energy medicine. And we're going to see how all of these work together, and exactly what we can find in the shaman's playground, the third river of healing. Thanks so much, Gemini, for playing with me and telling stories with me. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Susan. We really appreciate you here at Time Monk Radio, and another enjoyable show.
And thank you all for helping me to reweave the healing cloak of the ancients. May it cover us all and bring us wisdom. Good night, Gemini.
Good night, Susan. This concludes Part 8 of our 7 medicine series, The Wise Woman Way, with Susan Weed at Time Monk Radio.